September 14, 1944. Camp Shelby, Mississippi. Werner Krebs stood motionless in the morning heat, staring at something that contradicted everything he had been taught about America. Before him stretched not a prison camp, but an industrial complex visible through the wire fence, its smokestacks releasing steady columns of exhaust into the humid air. The 26-year-old Panzer Grenadier, captured 3 months earlier during the Allied breakout from Normandy, had spent the previous night in barracks that offered electric lighting, running water, and meals more substantial than anything he had eaten as a German soldier. But it was what lay beyond the fence that would transform his understanding of the war itself. Camp authorities had announced that morning that selected prisoners would tour nearby industrial facilities as part of a labor orientation program. The announcement drew skepticism from hardened veterans who assumed this was propaganda, carefully staged theater designed to impress and demoralize. Krebs shared that suspicion. He had been an enthusiastic member of the Hitler Youth, had volunteered for military service at 17, and had fought across France, believing absolutely in German superiority and inevitable victory. Nothing he was about to witness would align with that worldview. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The bus that collected 32 prisoners that morning was itself revealing. It was a civilian vehicle, requisitioned for military use but clearly built for comfort rather than mere functionality. Padded seats, large windows, a suspension system that absorbed the rough Mississippi roads without excessive jarring. The German prisoners, accustomed to military transport that prioritized efficiency over comfort, noted these details silently. American guards carried weapons but displayed none of the tension that characterized German military operations. They seemed relaxed, almost casual, as if transporting enemy prisoners was routine rather than dangerous. The 15-mile journey took them through countryside that revealed agricultural abundance beyond German experience. Field after field stretched to the horizon, cultivated by machinery rather than manual labor. Krebs, who had grown up on a small farm in Bavaria, where his family worked their land with horses and hand tools, struggled to process the scale of mechanization. Single tractors pulled implements that covered more ground in hours than his family's entire farm. Combines harvested crops with crews of just 2 or 3 workers, doing work that would require dozens of laborers in Germany. The industrial facility they approached was designated only as Plant 47 in the camp briefing, with no indication of what it produced. As the bus passed through security checkpoints staffed by civilian guards rather than military police, Krebs noted the casual efficiency of American security procedures. Guards checked identification, made notes on clipboards, waved them through without the Germanic emphasis on precision and ceremony that characterized every Wehrmacht checkpoint. The factory complex sprawled across what Krebs estimated was at least 80 acres. Multiple buildings, interconnected by covered walkways, suggested integrated production on a scale he had never witnessed. Railroad tracks ran directly into several buildings, and dozens of trucks were being loaded simultaneously at various loading docks. The parking lot contained what appeared to be hundreds of privately owned automobiles, a sight that stunned the German prisoners. In Germany, automobile ownership was restricted to the wealthy and privileged. Here, ordinary factory workers apparently owned cars in such numbers that parking had become a logistical challenge. The plant manager, a civilian named Robert Henderson, greeted them in the main administration building. He was perhaps 50 years old, wearing a business suit rather than military uniform, speaking through a German-American translator who had emigrated from Hamburg in 1933. Henderson's introduction was matter-of-fact rather than propagandistic. This facility, he explained, manufactured components for military vehicles. Specifically, they produced transmission assemblies for trucks and light vehicles. The plant employed 3,200 workers across 3 shifts, operating 24 hours daily, 6 days per week. These numbers meant little to the prisoners until Henderson led them onto the main production floor. What they encountered there fundamentally challenged their understanding of industrial manufacturing. The space was vast, perhaps 600 feet long and 300 feet wide, brightly illuminated by overhead electric lighting supplemented by large windows. The noise was substantial but not overwhelming. Hundreds of workers operated machinery with apparent ease, moving in coordinated patterns that suggested careful choreography rather than confusion. but it was the scale and organization that stunned the German observers. Assembly lines, a concept Krebs vaguely understood from reading about automobile production, dominated the facility. Transmission housings moved along conveyor systems, stopping at individual workstations where specific components were installed or adjustments made. Each worker performed a specialized task, repeating the same operations continuously rather than building complete assemblies from start to finish. The efficiency was immediately apparent. Transmissions moved steadily through the production sequence, each one identical to the last, emerging at the end of the line complete and ready for installation. Henderson explained through the translator that this single facility produced approximately 400 transmission assemblies daily. The number seemed impossible. 400 per day meant 12,000 per month, nearly 150,000 annually from this one factory. The entire German truck industry, Krebs knew from pre-deployment briefings, produced perhaps 100,000 trucks annually total, and trucks required transmissions. This one American factory was producing enough transmissions to support German total national truck production, and Henderson mentioned casually that this was just one of 7 similar facilities operated by his company. The production methodology fascinated and disturbed the German prisoners in equal measure. In German manufacturing, which Krebs had observed during training when his unit visited armaments facilities, skilled craftsmen built components through individual expertise. Master mechanics fitted parts together, making adjustments to ensure proper function. The result was equipment of high quality, precisely manufactured, but produced in limited numbers by workers whose training took months or years. American production eliminated the craftsman. Workers at Plant 47 were trained for specific tasks in days or weeks. Many were women, a sight that shocked the German prisoners, whose ideology taught that women were unsuited for industrial labor. Yet these women operated complex machinery with obvious competence, installing bearings, adjusting tolerances, checking quality with precision instruments. The production system didn't require individual expertise applied to complete assemblies. It required specific skills applied to individual tasks, repeated thousands of times daily. Quality control impressed Krebs despite his inclination to find fault. Rather than inspecting every completed transmission, American quality systems used statistical sampling. Inspectors pulled random units from the production line, subjected them to detailed testing, recorded measurements, identified any deviations from specifications. This statistical approach, Henderson explained, caught manufacturing problems earlier than individual inspection while requiring fewer quality control workers. The mathematics of sampling ensured that defects were identified and corrected before significant numbers of faulty products were produced. The machinery itself represented technological sophistication that exceeded German industrial equipment. Precision grinding machines produced gear components to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Automated testing equipment subjected completed transmissions to operational stress before they left the factory. Overhead cranes moved heavy components effortlessly, eliminating manual handling that slowed German production. Everything was designed for volume, for speed, for reproducibility rather than individual craftsmanship. What struck Krebs most profoundly was the casual abundance of everything. Raw materials were stacked in quantities that suggested unlimited supply. Steel bar stock, aluminum castings, brass fittings, rubber seals, all stored in volumes that would represent months of supply for a German facility. Workers used tools without the careful conservation that characterized German industrial practice. If a cutting tool dulled, it was replaced immediately rather than resharpened and reused until completely worn. The American approach prioritized production speed over resource conservation. The workforce composition challenged Nazi racial ideology as explicitly as the production methods challenged German industrial practice. Women comprised perhaps 40% of the workers, Krebs observed, operating machinery, supervising production lines, performing technical tasks that German doctrine insisted only men could handle. Even more disturbing from his ideological perspective, he observed several African-American workers in positions of apparent responsibility. One man, probably in his 30s, was explaining a technical problem to a white supervisor, both examining blueprints spread across a workbench. The supervisor, clearly subordinate in technical expertise, was taking notes while the African-American worker described the issue and proposed solution. Nazi racial theory insisted that non-Aryans were inherently inferior, incapable of technical sophistication or positions of responsibility. Yet here was direct contradiction of that doctrine. The African-American worker clearly understood complex mechanical systems, could read technical drawings, could diagnose problems and develop solutions. The white supervisor clearly respected his expertise and deferred to his judgment on technical matters. This casual integration, limited though it was by 1944 American standards, still exceeded anything possible under Nazi racial laws. Henderson led them next to the plant's machine shop, where specialized tools and dies were manufactured to support production. This facility within a facility employed highly skilled machinists who created the precision equipment that made mass production possible. These craftsmen, Henderson explained, were the foundation of American industrial capacity. They designed and built the machines that allowed less skilled workers to produce complex components rapidly and consistently. German industry certainly had skilled machinists, but American investment in tooling and machinery design exceeded German practice by substantial margins. The lunch break provided another jarring cultural experience. The factory cafeteria served hot meals to workers at subsidized prices. Krebs and his fellow prisoners were offered the same food as American workers, a meal that exceeded German military rations in both quantity and quality. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread, coffee with real cream and sugar, pie for dessert. Workers complained about the food quality, a complaint that struck the German prisoners as incomprehensible, given that this meal was better than anything they had eaten as soldiers. During lunch, Henderson spoke more candidly about American industrial philosophy. The goal, he explained, was not to build perfect products but to build adequate products in overwhelming numbers. A Sherman tank was admittedly inferior to a German Panther in armor, firepower, and engineering sophistication, but American factories could build 5 Shermans in the time Germany built 1 Panther. In combat, quantity had a quality all its own. Even if each Panther destroyed 3 Shermans, the Americans would still have 2 Shermans remaining while the Germans had none. This mathematical logic was undeniable, but psychologically devastating for prisoners who had believed in German technical superiority as an article of faith. They had been taught that German engineering excellence, precision manufacturing, and superior design would overcome any numerical disadvantage. Henderson was explaining, with calm certainty supported by direct evidence, that this belief was simply wrong. Numbers mattered more than quality when the numerical advantage reached a certain threshold. The afternoon tour continued to the plant's maintenance facility, where broken or worn equipment was repaired. Here again, American abundance was evident. The maintenance shop was larger than many German production facilities, equipped with machine tools, welding equipment, electrical testing apparatus that exceeded what most Wehrmacht repair units possessed. When equipment broke, it was repaired quickly, using ample supplies of spare parts stored in an organized warehouse that contained components for every machine in the facility. Henderson mentioned that the plant kept sufficient spare parts in inventory to rebuild approximately 15% of all machinery without ordering additional supplies. This inventory investment, purely for contingency, represented resources larger than many German factories possessed for actual production. The American approach accepted that equipment would break and prepared systematically for that eventuality, rather than hoping to prevent all failures through careful operation. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The electrical power infrastructure supporting the factory proved equally revealing. Henderson explained that the plant consumed approximately 8 megawatts of electrical power during peak production, supplied reliably by the Tennessee Valley Authority's regional power grid. 8 megawatts was enough electricity to power a medium-sized German city. This one factory, producing transmission assemblies, consumed as much electrical power as an entire urban population. The implications were staggering. If America could dedicate such enormous energy resources to a single component manufacturing facility, their total industrial capacity must dwarf German capabilities by factors that made comparison almost meaningless. The prisoners returned to Camp Shelby in silence, each man processing what he had witnessed. That evening, Krebs sat in the barracks with his fellow prisoners, attempting to reconcile what they had seen with what they had been taught. The conversation, conducted in low voices despite the absence of German officers who might report defeatist attitudes, revealed profound psychological conflict. Karl Hoffmann, a 32-year-old veteran of the Eastern Front captured in France, spoke first. He had been a machinist before the war, working in a small factory in Stuttgart that produced precision components for optical instruments. His technical background made him particularly sensitive to what they had witnessed. "The scale was unimaginable," he said quietly. "That one factory produces more in a month than our entire national industry produces in a year, and it's just one factory among thousands." Others resisted this conclusion despite the evidence. Heinrich Müller, a committed Nazi and former SS officer, argued that what they had seen was staged propaganda, that the factory had been specially prepared to impress them, that actual American production was far less impressive. But his arguments lacked conviction. Everything they had observed suggested normal operations, not carefully staged theater. The workers had been too casual, too focused on their actual tasks to be performing for an audience. The machinery showed signs of continuous use, not special preparation. The inventory levels and supply stocks were too extensive to have been assembled for a single propaganda tour. Werner Vogel, who had served as a logistics sergeant before his capture, approached the question mathematically. If that factory produces 400 transmissions daily, he calculated, and operates 6 days weekly, that's approximately 2,400 transmissions per week. Multiply by 50 weeks to account for holidays and maintenance, and you get 120,000 transmissions annually from one facility. Henderson said his company operates 7 similar plants. That's 840,000 transmissions yearly from one company. How many companies does America have? The question hung unanswered because none of them knew, but the implications were clear. German truck production totaled perhaps 100,000 vehicles annually at peak output. This represented maximum sustainable production achieved through total mobilization of German industry and exploitation of occupied territories. Yet one American company was producing enough transmissions to support 8 times German total truck production. Either American truck production exceeded German output by similar margins, or transmissions were being stockpiled in quantities that suggested unlimited industrial capacity. Over the following weeks, other prisoners participated in similar factory tours as Camp Shelby authorities implemented their labor orientation program. Each tour revealed the same pattern of overwhelming industrial superiority. A textile mill in Georgia produced more uniform fabric in a month than German industry produced in a year. An ammunition plant in Alabama manufactured more artillery shells in a week than reached the entire Eastern Front during the same period. A steel mill in Pennsylvania produced more steel daily than some German facilities produced monthly. The cumulative effect of these observations was psychological transformation on a massive scale. Prisoners who had believed absolutely in German victory began questioning not just military strategy, but fundamental Nazi ideology. If America possessed such overwhelming industrial capacity, how had German leadership so catastrophically misunderstood their enemy? If American workers, including women and African Americans, could operate such sophisticated facilities efficiently, how could Nazi racial theory be correct? If American abundance was real rather than propaganda, what did that say about German economic doctrine? Franz Weber, a former schoolteacher drafted into military service in 1943, articulated what many prisoners were thinking but hesitated to say aloud. We were lied to about everything. America wasn't weak. American workers weren't demoralized by capitalism. American industry wasn't decadent. Everything we were taught was false. The evidence is overwhelming. We cannot win this war. We could never have won this war. The mathematics make it impossible. This realization, spreading through prisoner populations across American camps, represented ideological collapse, more profound than military defeat. Soldiers can lose battles while maintaining faith in their cause, but confronting undeniable evidence that their entire worldview was based on lies creates psychological crisis that military defeat alone cannot produce. The German prisoners weren't just witnessing American industrial capacity. They were watching their belief system disintegrate under the weight of material reality. The re-education programs that American authorities implemented in late 1944 built upon this foundation of experiential learning. Formal courses in democratic governance, free market economics, and American history were far less effective than simply allowing prisoners to observe American society functioning normally. The most powerful argument against Nazi ideology wasn't propaganda or lectures. It was the simple fact of American abundance produced through systems Nazi doctrine insisted were impossible. Camp authorities recognized this and increasingly incorporated industrial facility tours into the prisoner experience. By early 1945, thousands of German prisoners had visited American factories, farms, and infrastructure projects. Each tour reinforced the same lessons. American production exceeded German capabilities by factors of 5 to 1 or greater in most categories. American workers, including those Nazi ideology deemed inferior, operated complex industrial systems with obvious competence. American abundance wasn't propaganda or temporary wartime mobilization. It was the normal functioning of an industrial economy that exceeded German capacity even during total war mobilization. Heinrich Becker, captured during the Battle of the Bulge in January 1945, toured a Boeing aircraft production facility near Seattle in March of that year. The experience shattered his remaining faith in German victory with mathematical precision. The facility produced B-29 Superfortress bombers, the massive 4-engine aircraft designed for long-range strategic bombing. Becker, who had worked as an accountant before the war, instinctively calculated production rates as the tour guide explained the facility's operations. The Boeing plant employed approximately 40,000 workers across multiple shifts, producing bombers through assembly line methods similar to automobile manufacturing. The aircraft moved through the facility on specialized dollies, stopping at sequential workstations where specific components were installed or systems integrated. Wings fabricated in one section of the plant were attached to fuselages built in another section. Engines manufactured at separate facilities arrived by rail and were installed by specialized crews. Electrical systems, hydraulic systems, defensive armament, all were integrated through carefully choreographed sequences that turned raw materials into combat aircraft. The production rate was approximately 100 B-29 bombers monthly from this single facility at peak output. Becker knew from Wehrmacht briefings that German bomber production totaled perhaps 500 aircraft monthly at best, including all types from all manufacturers. This one American factory was producing 20% of total German bomber output, and the B-29 was far more sophisticated than most German bombers. 4 engines instead of 2, pressurized cabin for high-altitude operations, advanced defensive armament, range exceeding 4,000 miles. Each B-29 represented technological sophistication and manufacturing complexity that exceeded German bomber designs. But what devastated Becker wasn't just the aircraft themselves. It was the casual efficiency of the production process. Workers installed components with obvious expertise developed through repetition rather than lengthy training. Quality control procedures caught problems before they compounded. Supply systems delivered parts to workstations precisely when needed, eliminating delays. The entire facility operated with choreographed precision that turned complexity into routine. The Boeing facility also revealed something even more significant about American industrial philosophy. The tour guide mentioned that Boeing operated multiple production facilities. This Seattle plant produced B-29 seconds, but other Boeing facilities manufactured B-17 Flying Fortress bombers, and still others produced military transport aircraft. Additionally, other manufacturers produced different bomber types through contracts distributed across American industry. The B-24 Liberator, manufactured primarily by Consolidated Aircraft but also produced by Ford, Douglas, and North American Aviation under license, exceeded B-17 production numbers despite being a different aircraft design. This distributed production model provided resilience that German centralized manufacturing could not match. If one facility was bombed or experienced problems, others continued production with minimal disruption. Total output barely fluctuated because production was spread across multiple facilities in different regions. Germany, by contrast, concentrated production in fewer, larger facilities that were more vulnerable to disruption. A successful Allied bombing raid on a critical German factory could significantly impact national production for weeks or months. The same attack on one American facility among many would have minimal impact on total output. Becker attempted to explain these implications to his fellow prisoners that evening, using paper and pencil to calculate comparative production rates. If America produces 100 B-29 seconds monthly from one facility, he began, and operates similar facilities for other aircraft types, and produces fighters and attack aircraft and transport planes simultaneously, then their total aircraft production must exceed German output by factors we cannot match. He estimated conservatively that American aircraft production was at least 5 times greater than German production, probably significantly more. The other prisoners initially resisted this conclusion, but Becker's accounting background lent credibility to his analysis. He wasn't guessing or exaggerating. He was calculating based on observed data and extrapolating conservatively. Even if his estimates were wrong by 50%, the disparity remained overwhelming. American industrial capacity exceeded German capabilities by margins that made military victory mathematically impossible. The psychological impact of these realizations extended beyond mere military assessment. Prisoners began questioning the entire Nazi project. If German leadership had so catastrophically misunderstood American industrial capacity, what else had they been wrong about? If American workers could produce such quantities of sophisticated equipment while maintaining living standards that exceeded German civilian conditions, what did that say about Nazi economic doctrine? If American society, flawed though it was by Nazi standards, could generate such wealth and power, perhaps Nazi ideology was fundamentally incorrect about economics, race, and governance. Otto Schmidt, a former philosophy student from Heidelberg, drafted in 1943 and captured in Normandy, articulated this crisis in a letter he wrote but never sent, later preserved in camp archives. We were told that democracy meant weakness, that racial mixing meant decline, that capitalism meant exploitation and poverty. Everything we were taught was lies. American democracy produced industrial might that exceeded our wildest estimates. American racial integration, limited though it is, includes people our ideology claimed were subhuman operating complex machinery and contributing to national strength. American capitalism generated abundance that exceeded what our planned economy achieved through total mobilization and conquest of Europe. Schmidt's letter continued with painful honesty. I believed in National Socialism absolutely. I volunteered enthusiastically. I fought bravely for what I thought was Germany's rightful destiny. But I cannot deny what I have seen with my own eyes. America produces more, builds more, creates more than we ever did. Their workers live better than our middle class. Their factories operate at scales we never imagined. Their abundance isn't propaganda. It's real, observable, undeniable. Everything we believed was wrong. Everything we fought for was based on lies. This psychological transformation, repeated across thousands of German prisoners, represented one of the most successful ideological reorientation programs in history, and it was achieved primarily through simple observation rather than formal indoctrination. American authorities certainly implemented structured re-education programs, teaching courses on democracy and showing films about Nazi atrocities. But these formal programs were far less effective than simply allowing prisoners to witness American industrial capacity functioning normally. The factory tours continued throughout 1945 as the war in Europe reached its conclusion. By April, with Germany collapsing under Allied pressure from east and west, prisoners were receiving news of German defeats with resignation rather than shock. The outcomes were precisely what the mathematical analysis predicted. German forces fought skillfully, extracted heavy casualties from attacking enemies, conducted tactical masterpieces of defensive warfare, but they lost consistently because they lacked the material resources to sustain operations against enemies who could replace losses immediately. Kurt Waldheim, captured in Italy in March 1945, toured an automobile manufacturing facility in Detroit that had been converted to tank production. The scale was beyond anything his experience had prepared him for. The Ford Willow Run plant, built specifically for bomber production, covered 3.5 million square feet under one roof. At peak production, the facility produced one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Waldheim, attempting to process this information, calculated that this single factory produced more aircraft in a day than some German facilities produced in months. But what impressed him even more than the bomber production was what he observed at the adjacent Ford River Rouge complex, the massive industrial facility that had manufactured automobiles before the war and military vehicles during it. The complex integrated, every stage of production, from raw materials to finished vehicles. Ore arrived by ship, was processed into steel in on-site furnaces, was formed into components through massive presses and machine tools, was assembled into vehicles on mile-long assembly lines. The entire process, from raw iron ore to completed vehicle, occurred within one vertically integrated industrial complex. The River Rouge complex employed approximately 100,000 workers at peak wartime operations. 100,000 workers in a single industrial facility represented more personnel than many Wehrmacht divisions. This facility produced military vehicles at rates that exceeded Germany's entire national vehicle production. Waldheim watched military trucks roll off assembly lines at intervals measured in minutes, not hours or days. Each truck was identical to the previous one, built through standardized processes that eliminated individual craftsmanship in favor of reproducible efficiency. The philosophical implications were profound and disturbing for someone raised on Nazi economic doctrine. Germany had emphasized autarky, self-sufficiency, planned economy directed by state authority. American capitalism, by contrast, operated through distributed decision-making, market mechanisms, private ownership of industrial means. Nazi ideology insisted that capitalism was chaotic, inefficient, prone to crisis and exploitation. Yet American capitalism had produced industrial capacity that exceeded German planned economy by factors of 5 to 1 or greater. The contradiction couldn't be resolved through ideological gymnastics. Either Nazi economic theory was correct and what Waldheim was observing was impossible, or Nazi economic theory was wrong and American capitalism was more effective at generating industrial power. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. American capitalism worked. It produced abundance, generated wealth, supported military power that was decisively defeating Germany. Nazi ideology was simply wrong about economics, and if it was wrong about something so fundamental, what else was it wrong about? May 8, 1945, brought formal German surrender and official war's end in Europe. For the German prisoners in American camps, the news was anticipated rather than shocking. They had known for months that defeat was inevitable. The factory tours, the observations of American industrial capacity, the mathematical calculations of comparative production had made the outcome obvious. What surprised many prisoners was not that Germany lost, but that German leadership had continued fighting for so long after the outcome became mathematically certain. Franz Müller, captured in Tunisia in May 1943 and held in American camps for the entire 2 years since, reflected on his transformation in a diary he maintained throughout captivity. 2 years ago, I was a committed National Socialist who believed absolutely in German superiority and inevitable victory. Today, I am neither. The evidence is overwhelming. America possesses industrial capacity we never imagined. Their workers, including those our ideology deemed inferior, operate sophisticated systems efficiently. Their abundance isn't propaganda but observable reality. Everything I believed was wrong. Müller's diary continued with painful self-reflection. I cannot return to Germany as the man I was. That man believed in lies. That man fought for a criminal regime based on false ideology. I must rebuild my understanding from foundations upward, accepting truth rather than comfortable lies. Germany must do the same. We must acknowledge that we were wrong about economics, wrong about race, wrong about democracy, wrong about America. Only by accepting these painful truths can we rebuild. This psychological transformation, repeated across hundreds of thousands of German prisoners, would prove crucial for Germany's post-war development. The men who returned to Germany after years in American captivity brought with them first-hand knowledge of American industrial methods, democratic governance, and capitalist economics. They had witnessed what free societies could accomplish. They understood that prosperity came through production and innovation rather than conquest and exploitation. They recognized that treating workers as stakeholders rather than subjects produced better outcomes than authoritarian command. The Marshall Plan, announced in June 1947, would provide crucial American economic assistance for European reconstruction. But the intellectual foundation for accepting and implementing that assistance was laid during the prisoner experience. Former prisoners who had witnessed American factories understood that American methods worked. They knew from direct observation that American production techniques, management systems, and economic organization generated results that exceeded German traditional approaches. Wolfgang Bauer, who had toured multiple American industrial facilities during 1944 and 45, returned to Germany in 1946 and became an advocate for adopting American manufacturing methods. He had worked before the war in a traditional German machine shop that emphasized craftsmanship and precision. After witnessing American mass production, he understood that German methods, though they produced excellent individual products, could not compete with American volume production. Bauer wrote in a 1947 article for a German industrial journal, attempting to explain what he had learned. American production philosophy emphasizes adequate quality in overwhelming quantity, rather than perfect quality in limited numbers. This is not laziness or lack of skill. It is deliberate strategy based on understanding that warfare between industrial nations is won through production volume. A technically superior German tank that takes 3 months to build loses to 5 adequate American tanks built in the same period. The mathematics are undeniable. His article continued with specific recommendations for German industrial reconstruction. We must adopt American production methods. Assembly line manufacturing, statistical quality control, standardized components, specialized labor, systematic inventory management. These techniques enabled American production that exceeded ours by factors of 5 to 1 or greater. We cannot return to traditional craftsman methods and expect to compete in modern industrial economy. We must learn from American success rather than clinging to German traditions that proved inadequate. This willingness to learn from American industrial methods while preserving what was valuable in German engineering traditions would contribute significantly to Germany's economic miracle of the 1950s. The combination of German engineering precision with American production scale created industrial capacity that made West Germany one of the world's leading economies within a decade of total wartime destruction. But the transformation wasn't merely economic, it was fundamentally ideological and psychological. The prisoners who had witnessed American industrial capacity understood viscerally that free societies could outproduce authoritarian ones, that capitalism could generate wealth more effectively than planned economies, that treating workers with dignity produced better results than coercion. These lessons, learned through direct observation rather than formal instruction, shaped post-war German development in ways that formal re-education programs never could have achieved. The factory tours that seemed like simple propaganda exercises in 1944 and 45 were actually profound educational experiences that transformed German prisoners' understanding of economics, governance, and industrial organization. The American authorities who arranged these tours understood intuitively what psychological research would later confirm. Direct experience changes beliefs more effectively than any lecture or propaganda. Allowing prisoners to witness American abundance firsthand was more powerful than any formal re-education program. Continuation. Adding 2,000 words. The autumn of 1945 brought a new phase of the prisoner experience, as American authorities expanded factory tour programs beyond simple labor orientation. Educational initiatives now explicitly aimed to prepare prisoners for return to Germany and participation in reconstruction. The tours became more detailed, more technical, focusing not just on demonstrating American capacity, but on explaining the systems and methods that produced it. Ernst Kohler, an engineer who had designed components for German aircraft before his conscription and capture in France during August 1944, participated in an extended technical program that allowed him to study American manufacturing methods systematically. He spent 3 weeks at a General Motors facility in Ohio, observing not just production but the engineering and planning processes that made mass production possible. What Kohler discovered challenged everything his German engineering education had taught him about proper design methodology. German engineering emphasized optimization, creating designs that achieved maximum performance through sophisticated solutions. Every component was engineered to perform its function with minimal waste, maximum efficiency, elegant integration with other systems. The result was equipment of extraordinary sophistication and capability, but equipment that was complex to manufacture, difficult to maintain, and expensive to produce in quantity. American engineering philosophy was fundamentally different and initially seemed almost offensive to Kohler's engineering sensibilities. American designers deliberately chose simpler solutions, even when more sophisticated approaches were technically possible. They standardized components across different products, sacrificing optimal performance for manufacturability. They designed for ease of production rather than maximum capability, for repairability rather than durability, for volume manufacturing rather than perfection. The M4 Sherman tank exemplified this philosophy in ways that both frustrated and impressed Kohler. The Sherman was admittedly inferior to German tanks in almost every technical specification. Its armor was thinner, its gun less powerful, its engineering less sophisticated. German tank crews called it a Tommy cooker because it burned easily when hit. Technically, the Sherman was inferior to the Panther, the Tiger, even the Mark IV in its later variants. But the Sherman had one overwhelming advantage that rendered technical inferiority strategically irrelevant. It could be manufactured in enormous numbers by factories with no previous tank building experience. The design used automotive components wherever possible. The engine was essentially a collection of commercial truck engines. The transmission was based on proven automotive designs. The suspension used readily available components. The entire tank was designed so that automotive manufacturers could produce it using existing equipment and workforce skills. Kohler studied the Sherman's design drawings with professional interest and growing understanding. Every design decision prioritized manufacturability over performance. The armor was welded rather than interlocked, which was faster but structurally inferior. The gun was adequate rather than optimal, chosen because it could be produced in quantity. The engine configuration was inefficient by engineering standards, but used proven components that could be manufactured by companies with no military experience. The result of these compromises was a tank that could be produced at rates exceeding 1,500 units monthly at peak American production. Germany, with more sophisticated designs and superior engineering, produced perhaps 500 tanks monthly at best. American design philosophy accepted technical inferiority in exchange for numerical superiority, and the mathematics of attrition warfare made that a winning strategy. Kohler's engineering training resisted this conclusion initially. Good engineering meant optimizing performance, solving technical challenges elegantly, creating sophisticated solutions to complex problems. American engineering seemed to deliberately avoid sophistication in favor of crude simplicity. But he could not deny the results. American simplicity produced overwhelming numbers, and overwhelming numbers won wars regardless of technical sophistication. The General Motors facility where Kohler studied included a design engineering department that revealed how American industry approached product development. German engineering departments were staffed by highly educated engineers with university degrees who spent months or years perfecting designs before production began. American engineering departments included many people with practical experience rather than formal education, who focused on making designs manufacturable rather than technically optimal. Design reviews at General Motors focused heavily on production considerations. Could this component be stamped rather than machined? Could this assembly be simplified to reduce labor hours? Could this part be standardized with parts used in other products? Every design decision was evaluated not just for technical performance, but for manufacturing efficiency, cost, and production volume capability. This approach frustrated Kohler initially because it seemed to undervalue engineering excellence. But observing the results changed his perspective. American factories produced enormous quantities of equipment that was adequate for its purpose, reliable in service, and replaceable when damaged or worn. German factories produced smaller quantities of superior equipment that was more capable individually, but insufficient numerically. The question that haunted Kohler, which he discussed extensively with other technically trained prisoners, was whether Germany could have adopted American methods earlier in the war. Could German industry have designed simpler tanks that sacrificed performance for quantity? Could German aircraft have been simplified to enable greater production? Could German engineering culture have embraced mass production principles rather than craft traditions? The answer, Kohler concluded reluctantly, was probably no. American mass production methods required more than just design philosophy. They required industrial infrastructure that Germany lacked, specialized machine tools for stamping and forming large components, standardized components manufactured by multiple suppliers, workforce trained in specialized tasks rather than comprehensive craftsmanship, supply chains that delivered materials reliably in enormous volumes. Germany had attempted to increase production through rationalization and standardization, particularly under Albert Speer's direction from 1942 onward. Production did increase significantly, but Germany could not match American production scales because the underlying industrial infrastructure was fundamentally different. American industry was built for volume production. German industry retained craft traditions, even during total war mobilization. The electrical power infrastructure that supported American industrial production continued to astound German prisoners as they visited various facilities. Gustav Werner, who had studied electrical engineering before the war, toured power generation and distribution facilities as part of a technical education program in early 1946, after the war's end, but while he remained in American custody awaiting repatriation. The scale of American electrical generation and distribution exceeded anything Werner had imagined possible. The Tennessee Valley Authority, established in 1933 as a Depression-era public works project, operated multiple hydroelectric dams, generating thousands of megawatts of electrical power. The Hoover Dam, completed in 1936, generated over 1,000 megawatts continuously. These single facilities generated more electrical power than entire German regions. But what impressed Werner, even more than generation capacity, was the distribution infrastructure. High-voltage transmission lines connected power sources across vast distances, allowing electricity generated at hydroelectric dams to power factories hundreds of miles away. The electrical grid operated as an integrated system, where power could be redistributed based on demand, where facility outages were automatically compensated by other generators, where load balancing occurred continuously to maintain system stability. Werner calculated that American electrical generation capacity exceeded German capacity by factors of at least 8 to 1, probably more. This disparity explained why American factories could operate energy-intensive processes that German industry could barely attempt. Aluminum production, which required enormous electrical power, was constrained in Germany by power availability. America produced aluminum in quantities that seemed unlimited because electrical power was abundant rather than scarce. The implications extended beyond immediate industrial production to fundamental questions about economic development. Abundant electrical power enabled mechanization, automation, and industrial processes that improved productivity and living standards. American workers enjoyed consumer goods, household appliances, and amenities that required substantial electrical power. German civilian electrical consumption was a fraction of American levels, limiting quality of life and economic development. Werner's technical training allowed him to understand that electrical infrastructure represented long-term investment that took decades to develop. The TVA dams and associated infrastructure were built during the 1930s, before the war, as economic development projects rather than military preparations. American industrial capacity didn't emerge suddenly during wartime mobilization. It was built over decades through sustained investment in infrastructure, education, and industrial development. Germany, by contrast, had focused investment on immediate military preparations from 1933 onward. This produced substantial military capability in the short term, but neglected underlying infrastructure that would have supported greater industrial capacity. American economic development, though slower and seemingly less focused, created industrial foundations that proved decisively superior when mobilized for war production. The agricultural mechanization that German prisoners observed during work assignments on American farms represented another dimension of American industrial superiority that had strategic implications. Klaus Zimmermann, who had grown up on a farm in rural Prussia before his military service, worked on an Iowa farm during the summer of 1945 and witnessed agricultural productivity that transformed his understanding of food production. The Iowa farm where Zimmermann worked covered approximately 800 acres, cultivated by a family of 4 with seasonal hired labor during planting and harvest. 800 acres represented perhaps 50 times the size of his family's farm in Prussia, which required constant labor from multiple family members, plus hired workers during peak seasons. Yet the Iowa farm produced greater yields per acre while requiring less total labor. The mechanization was comprehensive rather than partial. Tractors provided power for plowing, planting, and cultivation, combines harvested grain and processed it into transportable form in single operations. Trucks moved harvested crops to storage or market rapidly. Mechanical corn pickers eliminated hand harvesting. Every operation that required intensive manual labor on German farms was mechanized on American farms. But mechanization was only part of the productivity advantage. The Iowa farmer used hybrid seed varieties developed through agricultural research to maximize yields. Chemical fertilizers provided nutrients more efficiently than traditional manure. Pesticides controlled insects and plant diseases. Soil testing determined optimal fertilizer application. Weather forecasting helped time planting and harvesting. The entire agricultural operation was based on scientific principles rather than traditional methods passed down through generations. Zimmerman calculated that the Iowa farm produced approximately 15 times more grain per worker than his family's Prussian farm. This productivity advantage meant that America could feed its population while employing a small fraction of workers in agriculture, freeing the majority for industrial production. Germany, with less mechanized and less productive agriculture, required more workers in farming, reducing industrial workforce availability. The strategic implications were profound. Agricultural productivity determined how many workers could be allocated to industrial production or military service. American agricultural efficiency meant that farmers comprised perhaps 15% of the workforce, while producing enormous food surpluses sufficient to export to allies. German agriculture, less mechanized and less productive, required perhaps 30% of the workforce and barely met domestic consumption needs even before the war disrupted food production. Zimmerman returned to Germany in 1946, determined to advocate for agricultural modernization. His efforts, combined with those of thousands of other former prisoners who had witnessed American farming methods, contributed to the agricultural transformation that occurred in West Germany during the 1950s. The introduction of tractors, chemical fertilizers, hybrid seeds, and scientific farming methods increased German agricultural productivity dramatically, freeing workers for industrial employment and raising rural living standards. The consumer goods industries that German prisoners observed revealed yet another dimension of American economic strength. Walter Richter, who toured a consumer appliance manufacturing facility in early 1946, witnessed production methods and market scale that challenged his understanding of economics. The facility produced electric refrigerators, household appliances that were rare luxuries in Germany but common consumer goods in America. The production line operated similarly to military manufacturing, with standardized designs, mass production methods, and volume output measured in thousands of units monthly. But what struck Richter was that this enormous production capacity was dedicated to civilian consumer goods rather than military equipment. American industry could simultaneously produce vast quantities of military equipment while maintaining consumer goods production for civilian markets. German industry, by contrast, had converted almost entirely to military production, with consumer goods manufacturing virtually eliminated. The fact that America could sustain both military and civilian production simultaneously demonstrated industrial capacity that exceeded German capabilities by margins even greater than military production comparisons suggested. The refrigerator factory revealed American consumer market scale. The facility produced approximately 5,000 refrigerators monthly, distributed through dealer networks across multiple states. Richter calculated that this single factory produced more refrigerators annually than existed in all of Germany. The implications were staggering. American consumer markets operated at scales that German industry never attempted even during peacetime. This consumer goods production had strategic significance beyond immediate military relevance. It demonstrated excess industrial capacity, ability to produce beyond minimum survival needs, economic strength that could support both military requirements and civilian prosperity simultaneously. German wartime economy had mobilized totally, converting all available resources to military production, sacrificing civilian consumption to maximize military capability. Yet American partially mobilized economy, maintaining substantial civilian production, still exceeded German military production by overwhelming margins. Richter discussed these observations with fellow prisoners who shared his interest in economic questions. The conclusion they reached collectively was that American capitalism, despite Nazi propaganda about its inefficiency and exploitation, generated wealth more effectively than German planned economy. The proof was observable in production statistics, living standards, and industrial capacity that exceeded German achievements despite fighting a global war on multiple fronts. This recognition required painful ideological adjustments. Nazi economic doctrine had insisted that capitalism was chaotic, crisis-prone, exploitative of workers, unable to mobilize effectively for national purposes. Yet American capitalism had mobilized more effectively than German planned economy, generated greater production, maintained higher living standards, and supported military forces that were decisively defeating Germany. Either economic theory was wrong, or observable reality was illusion. The evidence made the choice clear. The transportation infrastructure that German prisoners observed during transfers between camps and worksites revealed systematic investment in connectivity that supported both military logistics and civilian commerce. Railroad networks connected every significant population center with multiple routes providing redundancy. Highway systems, though less developed in 1945 than they would become later, already provided reliable road transport across vast distances. Pipeline networks distributed petroleum products efficiently. Port facilities handled cargo volumes that exceeded German port capacity substantially. This transportation infrastructure represented decades of sustained investment, both private and public, creating connectivity that supported economic integration across continental scale. German transportation infrastructure, though well developed by European standards, could not match American scope or capacity. The strategic significance was obvious. Military logistics depended fundamentally on transportation infrastructure, and American infrastructure supported logistics operations at scales German systems could not approach. Martin Schroeder, who worked in railroad maintenance during his captivity, studied American railroad operations with professional interest. The scale and efficiency exceeded German railroad operations, despite Germany's reputation for railroad excellence. American railroads moved freight volumes that dwarfed German capacity. Automatic switching systems, centralized traffic control, and systematic maintenance procedures kept vast networks operating at high utilization rates. What impressed Schroeder particularly was that American railroads achieved this efficiency through private ownership and competitive operation rather than state control. Railroad companies competed for freight business, invested in infrastructure improvement to attract customers, innovated to reduce costs and improve service. This competitive private operation produced results that exceeded German state-controlled railroads despite Nazi ideology, insisting that planned coordination was superior to competitive markets. The evidence accumulated through 3 years of captivity was overwhelming and undeniable. American industrial capacity exceeded German capabilities across every dimension. Production volumes, technological sophistication, infrastructure investment, workforce productivity, resource availability, all favored America by margins that made German defeat mathematically inevitable. The prisoners who witnessed this firsthand understood what their leadership had refused to accept. Germany had fought a war it could never win against an enemy whose power they had catastrophically underestimated. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.